Welcome to the Radical Rhythm Podcast. This has been created for those of us that love radical women who live perhaps by the rules, but also question and challenge the status quo. We want more from our lives, to enjoy our sexuality, to explore radical thought, and to celebrate women who have lived and continue to live unconventional lives. Hi, I'm Dr. Toni Baer, sexologist, educator, activist, and definitely a radical woman. Thank you for joining me as I share stories of women challenging the status quo and living life to the fullest. Join me as we unapologetically march to the beat of a different drummer together. Well, welcome, Ms. Vi Johnson, to season 2 of the Radical Rhythm Podcast. As I said last episode, and I don't know if you listened to it yet, Vi Johnson will be our continuing guest all through season 2, like season 1. And Vi, I am so appreciative of your participation in with this podcast. Thank you so much for coming again today.
Toni, you do know how much I love to pick your brain, but I do have one minor complaint here.
Uh-oh.
One of us is in the wrong place. And since I'm in Evansville, that would make the person in the wrong place you.
I apologize. I am getting paid to be a university professor by showing up, evidently. And we're almost done, Vi. I'm 6 months away. So I can't wait to come out and visit the library again in Evansville. So let's get started with today. The topic I wanted to talk about, and I'm so happy you agreed, is about fetishes. People talk about kinks, they talk about alternative lifestyles, but this word fetish is just used interchangeably with other words. And I thought, let's just make it about fetishes today. So how would you define it? Or
let's start with that, okay? Because we toss around as a society the word fetish in a lot of different ways that aren't necessarily what you and I are thinking. So that you and I are on the same team here, let's start with definitions. Fetish. It can be said, somebody is obsessed with something. He's got a real fetish for that subject. Let's move that one off the table.
That would be like an obsession.
An obsession, yeah. Or as the kids say now, he's got a real heart on for, but that crosses into definition 3. So let's just say obsession and move that one off the table. Mm-hmm. Number 2, which is where this begins to get a little tricky. A fetish is an object that the person who has the object believes has some sort of extra magical power. A rabbit's foot is a fetish. Pittsburgh Steelers fans who will never change their shirt for a specific game because that's their lucky shirt. The shirt becomes a fetish, an object that they think has magical power. Now, let's put a little pin in that and then cross over into the wonderful world of kink. Mm-hmm. When we talk about having a fetish, it's for an object that in reality does create magic, because magic is a sexual desire. A fetish is something that you see, touch, feel, emote over, that immediately goes anywhere from increasing your sexual desire to giving you a full-blown sexual experience. Some people can look at their fetish object and have an orgasm just looking at it. Mm-hmm. For some, they need the object to have the sexual desire and the climax. For some, you can just think about it. Now, when I said let's put a pin in definition 2, if you think about the rabbit's foot, you believe the rabbit's foot is lucky. Is the magic real? Probably not. Let's think of a Steelers fan and go back to that shirt. Well, every time the team wins and you're wearing your lucky shirt, it's more power into the shirt because my team won. Now, if you're wearing your lucky shirt and they lose, it just doesn't have enough power that day. But if we take the belief in the object and then bring it into a sexual world, to some extent, it really does have power. Because the power the fetish object has is the power to arouse sexual desire, or even to some extent, bring that desire to a full-blown orgasm. And if sex is magic, then the fetish object, or the object of the fetish, depending on how you want to look at it, really is a magical object.
Wow. So your second definition about the rabbit's foot in the Steelers shirt, I would call superstition. But
It comes true, it's magic.
right. So if something isn't proved as a causational kind of relationship, it's superstition. But if we do prove that there is an action and we know sexually that there's an erotic response, then it's magic.
That.
Okay. Wow. So I would imagine there are a million fetishes.
If it can be eroticized, it is a sexual fetish object. Now, that means anything that is on this great earth, or possibly in this universe, could become an object of sexual arousal to someone.
Now, I might be asking a question I know I don't know the answer to. I'm not sure you do. Is different fetishes, are there certain fetishes still that are in the, what do you call the book of dysfunctions, psychological disorders?
DSM,
Yes.
the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's been a long time since I've looked at DSM-5, but I think, and without having it in front of me, I think fetishes falls into SM, BDSM, in terms of, as long as it is not in any way diminishing your life, it's another way of love. Now, if the fetish gets to the point where it's interfering with your ability to function, then we have a problem. Now, fetishes. The one that is talked about within this community the most, and it's probably the most common, is a foot fetish. Now, does that necessarily mean that every salesman in a shoe store has a foot fetish? Maybe, maybe not, but it is most assuredly the ideal place to enjoy your fetish, as long as you're not showing the problems or joys that can go with it while you're working with a customer. A friend of mine, who now is in his 30s, talked about acquiring a foot fetish as a 4 or 5-year-old because of Sesame Street.
Wow.
And when I asked, because I was looking kind of quizzical, and I said, huh? He said there was a Sesame Street episode that was on when he was probably about 4. And it was a song about feet, and feet were moving all over the stage, and happy feet, and this feet, and that feet. And he was at the age of remembering that he was discovering self and watching this episode, and evidently the two clicked, and the foot fetish was born.
Wow.
Another that used to be quite common, that isn't as much anymore, is hair.
How so?
Think of the scent of hair. Think of hair and where hair is when you're in the midst of wild love. more than likely it's in your face, near your face, while you're in the height of passion. You're inhaling it, you're inhaling the scent of it. It may be caressing you or around your face and skin. Uh, it was such a common fetish in the Victorian era that the hair of your lover was usually carried with you so that you could smell it, feel it, understand the connection, and become erotically connected and therefore aroused because you had this particular piece of your lover. There are 1,000 fairly common fetishes. Bondage is not just a way to achieve all of the fun and play. The rope itself can become a fetish object. Just seeing it triggers the mind to trigger the Southern mind to get ready for wonder and ultimately sex. So the connection gets made that the rope creates the bondage creates the play leads to the orgasm, and kind of like a math equation about if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C.
How does one who has a rope fetish walk through Home Depot?
I would say with a lot of joy and hopefully not tight pants.
Right, right. Never thought that there would be people walking around with erections at a hardware store, but
Oh, come on.
how naive of me. Vi, very naive. Wow, is there any fetish that's kind of really mainstream that you said hair, so and then when you talked about the piece of the hair, my mind went right back to like Civil War movies about lovers giving hair when the man went off to war. And I
Mhm.
never associated that before, but that makes sense. And that was pretty common. I know lots of women that are attracted to men who talk about liking their husbands or their boyfriends that are very hairy, like a bear with like fur on the back and all over the place. And then there are individuals who, you're one of those. Then there's individuals who like clean shaved people, like just a hairless person.
Now,
Um,
we sit on a thin line. Is it that you like it and you like this body type, or you can't get off without thinking about it?
that was going to be my next question. Is it a preference or is it a fetish?
Exactly. And
That's your answer? Exactly.
there's a thin line.
Right.
Uh, it's a very thin line. If
So
I,
what other fetishes then? If there's thin lines, there's hair,
you
feet.
want common or you want more exotic?
Well, let's give me one more common one and then let's go to the exotic.
Until public health was thrust into the fore, smoking women, cigarette smoking women, was a serious fetish.
I thought you said smoking women. Like
Well, yeah, I didn't
such
say
hot
smoking.
woman, she's smoking. Right.
Women who smoked.
Mhm.
That imagery was actually fetishized,
Yeah.
and some couldn't get off without the imagery or their partner, their female partner, with a cigarette or being able to see it in the ashtray, thinking of her, it had her lip print on it, and so on. Smoking women was a very common fetish.
It makes sense. And my mother would have been one of those individuals. First it was smoking and the lipstick. And then for a period of time with that handle, that smoking handle,
Oh, yeah.
and many times when we talked about it, I'd ask her where it come from. And many of her cigarette movements, etc., come from the movies and imitating famous actresses.
Or watching some man watching you sticking that long, hard thing in your mouth.
Oh, not in my mother's generation. Come on, Vi.
I will remind you of what my mother told me, which is How do you think you got here?
Right. Right.
That nice long hard thing was going between her lips.
All right, let's get away from my mother. I have this image of my mother right now. Let's go to the more infrequent fetishes that might be found.
Almost any geek, especially cosplaying geek, may or may not have a very thin line between their persona and their erotic desires. Especially back in the well, I'm going back about 15 to 20 years into the very early days of furries and cosplay.
Could you tell our audience what cosplay means?
Okay, costume play is probably a better way to put it. Being able to dress in the role or in the image of a hero, a fantasy, to if you're going to, for instance, role play the naughty little schoolgirl, actually getting into the schoolgirl's uniform. Now it's called cosplay. Back in my day, it was just putting on the clothes to get into the headspace. Now the kids have a name for it. When we did the library conference a year ago, one of my next gens reminded me that he got turned on to harnesses and the look of a harness against a man's chest, not because of a Tom of Finland drawing, but because of the He-Man cartoon. And I actually had to think back to it. And he said the harness became a fetish for him because of watching the cartoon. Right. To the point where he donned his hero's costume and got into not just the role in his head, but the fetish of what he looked like. And he was turning himself on. Mm-hmm. Which I suppose is one way of doing it. But coming back to when we started this, almost anything can be fetishized. If it makes you hard, and that works for any gender. If it gives you the psychological, emotional, spiritual, or genital hard-on, it's a fetish object or a fetish. If you're geeky enough, I suppose thinking about atoms, quarks, and string theory could probably give somebody a hard-on. More years ago now than I care to remember, a man that I saw every year at the National Leather Association's conference of Living in Leather, always immaculately dressed, 3-piece gray flannel suit, perfectly tailored to him, brilliant man, but you're at a leather conference, you're at a kink conference, you are wearing gray flannel. After easily 3 or 4 years of seeing him and, the casual greetings, I finally said, can I buy you a cup of coffee? I've got a question. And, we sat down at the table and I said, what are you into? And if it's, if it's too personal, that's fine, but I'm dying to know. And he said, gray flannel. It was his fetish, all the way down to his underwear. It was always gray flannel. It was always rubbing up against him. He was always erect because he got to be in his object all the time. Mm-hmm. Some would argue that the early cross-dressers were cross-dressing not just to touch their feminine side, but because the clothes themselves gave them a hard-on. So was it that you had a hard-on for your wife's underwear because it belonged to your wife, or you had a hard-on for your wife's underwear because you happened to be wearing it? Right. it's still fetishized because it became an erotic symbol that led to arousal.
Right. So, I mean, I think I just showed this in class yesterday, the gender bred person and the unicorn, and the difference between what's in our head, our sexual identity, what's in our heart, our romantic, um, um, I don't know, our romantic feelings, what's in our genitalia, our sexual drive, what's in the way that we adorn ourselves, our sexual expression, right? So when you take an object such as women's underwear, and if someone is a self-defined male, right, and they're taking that underwear, it could be part of their sexual identity that they see themselves as a woman. It could be part of their sexual expression um, because they think it's sexy, and it could be part of their sexuality because it gives them a hard on,
Yes.
right? It's the difference. I'm an old dog. I'm beginning to get this. I'm beginning to understand the difference between identity, expression, sexuality, masculinity versus femininity, and the fluidity between. Yeah, I'm imagining you can take almost any fetish object and have it as a part of your identity of who you are, use it as an expression,
Yes.
and also it could get you off.
Yeah.
But I thought that a fetish was only something that got you off. Does it have to get you off or make you hard to be part of the definition of fetish? It could be those other parts too, but it has to have the sexual reaction to it or sexual action?
To be a sexual fetish. Like I said, not a magical object, although that one's iffy. For it to be an object of arousal, for it to
Mhm.
be classified as this is my fetish object, it's got to arouse somewhere.
Okay.
Uh, the real controversial issues become, is this the only way I can get off? Yes,
Mhm.
the fact that it can arouse me if I see it is wonderful. But if the only way I can get off is to have that object either in my mind, somewhere near me, touching me, or in my hand, now you're getting into areas that could potentially be dangerous to yourself and or to your partner.
Right.
Because how far are we willing to go to have our fetish object, or what it is that turns us on? Is that fetish object now an obsession? And now you're getting into questions only psychiatry and psychology can answer.
Right. But if I put something on once a week and it's on a Saturday afternoon and it's consensual for all people that are in the room at that time, then have at it, right?
Or every time I touch it, I think of you, and suddenly I'm horny as a three-dick dog. It's still, it still falls into that same category.
Okay. Now this is going to be a hard question because I always try to stump you somewhere, right? Um, the Carter Johnson Leather Library and Collection that you have in Evansville, 2 whole buildings plus half your house. So it's 2.5 buildings full of mostly books, but other things as well.
Mhm.
If you had to identify the number one fetish that is represented in your entire collection, what would that be?
Probably bondage. Bondage, not just as an act that's part of the SM family, but the concept of bondage as in, this is my fetish. Unless I am tied up, I can't get off. Or if I think of being tied up, I can get off without external help.
Mm.
Uh, Number one is bondage.
Wow, I didn't think you were going to say that. I thought you were going to say leather.
because you don't necessarily, leather as part of who we are and part of our identity is one thing. Leather is a fetish, means this is an object of sexual arousal, not just something that makes me feel good or look good. If I touch it, I'm aroused. If I smell it, I'm aroused. I cannot become aroused without it. Is fairly common, but not as common as bondage.
Wow. Okay. Because I was going to say, remember it was my late 20s into the whole 30s. I have this leather jacket. I still have this leather jacket. It was gifted to me at the beginning of at the end of my marriage and almost at the beginning of my gayness. And so I have this leather jacket. And, maybe it was the period of time or the generation, I would love the cologne Drakkar. And when I would wear Drakkar and smell it on me and smell the leather at the same time, I always said, I don't need a girlfriend. I'm happy by myself. I'm happy who I am. And I thought, I think this is a sexual fetish. However, I didn't need it to get off. I didn't have to wear my leather or have Drakkar on. I could have a girlfriend somewhere else and be wearing a bathing suit, right? And get off.
But the two together could get you off.
True.
Now, let's look at that just for grins and giggles. Was it the jacket or was it the leather? In other words, could I have put the same scent on a glove and caused the same reaction in you, at which time it's the leather? What you're describing is a fetish for the jacket.
I don't know. We would have to go back in time in a time capsule, and then we'd have to experiment, I would think. Because, the jacket still to this day, when I wear it, I feel like King Kong. I feel big and indestructible. But when I wear Drakkar, I think of my coming out experience, right? I don't think about sexuality anymore at this point with Drakkar and leather. So the leather jacket could have been a suit of armor and a new identity.
Yeah.
And that in itself made me feel good, if not sexually turned on. But it could have been, because it seemed to be at the time, the aroma. It was the mix of the smell of leather and the smell of the cologne together. In that case, a glove or something else would have worked the same way. But I wouldn't know unless I could turn back the hands of time.
And scent, by the way, is its own fetish. That goes off in a whole different direction. A lot of different books have been written on sexual arousal and odor. Scent is a much way of putting it, but odor.
Yeah. And I'm imagining there's a million different types of scents or odors that turn different people on in different ways.
Yeah.
Right.
Most common of those currently is the odor of a cigar.
Oh, okay. I'll never forget going to my first gay leather man's party, and I'm only 5'6", and my nose is right at armpit length or armpit height of most men, right? And I didn't know that not wearing deodorant was a thing in the leather men's culture. And I learned very quickly. And now it doesn't bother me. At first, it was quite, I don't know, what would the word be? Pungent? I don't know. Pungent? Is that it? I think putrid. I don't know. It was a lot to take in at the time.
See, that can go down a whole different rabbit hole in terms of how we as people feel about that which is natural. And I'm sure this may go into a whole different Zoom at some point. We bust our ass because we are convinced that our natural aroma, our natural scent is somehow wrong. So we kill ourselves to clean it, purify it, cover it, hide it, fill in the blank. Now I'm not talking about 3-Day-Old Funk. It's a whole different fetish. But our natural aroma is our fingerprint. So why we are convinced that it's something we should be ashamed of is beyond me. So, when I remember my earliest trips into bars and smelling natural aromas, natural odors, rarely did any of the brothers at that point, or at least not that were physically close to Jill and me, go into the 3, 4, 5-day grunge thing, because that is its own fetish. And I know a lot of people who are into it. But there was no need to cover it. And part of being that manly man was not needing to cover it, not being ashamed of it. And therefore, with a couple of them, I could go, Tom's around. Because I knew the smell of his natural aroma and the fact that he was a smoker. So there was that normal scent of him about 2 hours out of, what he smelled like when he just taken a shower 2 hours ago. He was now fresh and clean and had a cigarette. It was a very distinct odor. We all have it. Or knowing when my maid is around, because she wears a very distinct body oil. And the natural scent of her and that body oil might be, well, never mind.
That's a good place to cut off the podcast. Just we've gone a half an hour already, Vi. Why? We just I talk and time flies, and I can't believe we're done the show already. Vi, thank you so much. Is there any advice that you would give somebody that feels that they have a fetish, something that turns them on, and they feel a little bit embarrassed?
Depends on your fetish. My first thought would be enjoy it, control it, and don't let it control you.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you, Vi, so much for being a guest again, season 2 of the Radical Rhythm podcast. Thank you for listening to the Radical Rhythm podcast today. It has truly been my pleasure to invite guests and talk to you about my passion, the joy in our sexuality, and radical women who march to the beat of a different drum. If you'd like to work with me, Dr. Toni Baer, I have a community where I give seminars every month. I also have a coaching program, both group and individual, and also a course, a self-directed course, because it's all about experiencing the joy life has to offer. I'd love to work with you. Check out my link below, www.tonibaeredd.com. I'd love to see you next week for another broadcast, and don't let anyone dim your shine.